Good evening. Hope you are well. And I'm back. I'm back with another session. This is session number 18. And as you know, every time I say that Department of English, Adantata Mahavidyalaya, has been organizing a special lecture series with eminent speakers since May. And several eminent speakers already delivered their insightful lecture on our platform. And today, as you know me, Gautam Maji, assistant professor, as the head of the Department of English, back with another session. And in this session, we have got another eminent speaker. Eminent speaker, not only she is professor, but she is also the principals of Women's Christian College, Kolkata. So today we are really fortunate to get her on our platform. So without further delay, I would like to welcome our honorable ma'am on our platform. Ma'am, welcome to our digital platform.
Good evening, everyone. I'm really happy to be present here this evening with all of you, and I am indebted to Shadhan Chandra Mahavidyalaya and especially the English department of this college for giving me this opportunity to share a few words with you on Emily Dickinson. I put on record my thanks for the principal of the college, Dr. S.F. Huck, and Professor Gautam Maji, the head of the Department of English in this college. So it is really an
Before
honor to be present.
Okay, before ma'am you commence your lecture, then I would like to share with you that I'm a former student, and I really take pride in the fact that the kind of human being she is. She always stretches her helping hand to all of us, even the current student and the former students. And I would like to share with you a few experiences with her. The first time when I just asked her, rather approached her ma'am for this one, and I have never had this kind of experience. She said me, it is my, uh, I'm fortunate to have this thing. So I don't know exactly what kind of, it's a really honor to me to have our honorable ma'am on our platform. Before she delivers, I like to share with you her illustrious academic career. Right now, she is principal and professor in English of Women's Christian College, Kolkata, since 2008. And previously, she worked as reader in English at St. Paul's Cathedral Mission College, Kolkata, and she got several awards and distinctions that she won the Junior Fellowship, Research Fellowship from University Grants Commission in 1981, and two pre-doctoral research grants from the American Studies Research Center, Hyderabad, India, in the year 1989-1990, and won the National Scholarship from the Ministry of Human Resources, Government of India, New Delhi, for BA Honours examination result in the year 1984, which was before my birth. And won the Kathleen Raymond Award for English Literature from La Martiniere for Girls School, Calcutta, and it's a huge thing that she has already worked on, and illustrious career already I have mentioned, and she is noted. She has written several short stories and poems, which already published in several noted journals and daily newspapers. So, on this note, I would like to again convey our heartfelt thanks to Honorable Ma'am for accepting our invitation. And today we are looking forward to getting an insightful session from you. So, ma'am, over to you, and thank you very much once again.
Thank you, Gautam. So once again, I reiterate my grateful thanks to you and the entire department for having me over this evening. And without further ado, I shall get into the topic. And as all of you know, the topic that I shall be discussing today is the poetry of paradox or the paradox of poetry. Emily Dickinson, the enigmatic poet. And this is, well, because partly because uh, some of her poems are in the English honors syllabus of the University of Calcutta, but definitely we shall not remain constrained within the syllabus, and that is not one of the main reasons as to why I decided to uh, address this particular theme. I feel that a working acquaintance with the poetry of Emily Dickinson is very important for our understanding of the general drift of American poetry, its origin, its development, and the entire poetic process as it unfolded in America. In the 19th century, Emily Dickinson was came to be recognized as a major poetic voice, and so we really need to engage with her poems if we are to understand what transpired in this domain later, or what contemporary American poetry is like today. So, and I decided to focus on this particular aspect of her poetry, that is the figure of speech, or the stylistic element of paradox, which she uses so deftly and which is seen to animate both her vision and her aesthetics. So, paradox is a kind of overriding stylistic principle which she uses so wittily and so interestingly in her poems. So, as a tool, as a method of inquiry, as an aesthetic, you know, as a logical term. So, in various regard, we find that Emily Dickinson is applying this particular method, to probe deep philosophies and profound thought. Now, the paradoxical element is evident in her life situations as also in her poetry. For instance, we should realize that though Dickinson was a 19th century poet, her poetry is surprisingly modern in thought, style, tone, and temper, thus challenging literary classifications made on the basis of historical eras. Though Dickinson published very few poems in her lifetime, say about 10 or 12 from a total output of some 1800 poems, she earned recognition as a poet while she lived. Notwithstanding the fact that her publications were so few, she managed to gain a recognition during her lifetime. Though she shunned public life and the national discourse around her, she grew into a cult figure, her very reclusiveness contributing to the myth about her. The letters that she wrote to friends, relatives, mentors, and others, numbering about 1,000 over the span of her lifetime, provide a wealth of first hand information about her. Yet, we scarcely know Dickinson, the woman and the poet. While she was perfectly happy to occupy domains traditionally considered to be feminine, such as the kitchen and her garden, a little enclosed domestic space, in her poetry, Dickinson easily transcended these spheres, venturing into the so called male preserves of literary creativity, overturning in the process the contemporary and conventional perception of gender roles and intellectual agency. Paradox thus is seen to inform not only the poet's life situations and attitudes, but is found to permeate her vision and art in ingenious ways which constantly challenge, stimulate, and tease the reader into reappraisals. In Dickinson's hands, we see that paradox, having subsumed the qualities of other related figures of speech based on contrast, such as irony, epigram, antithesis, and oxymoron, is not only a part of a poetic language, but is also a type of language in itself, which inscribes a secret system of meaning through its code of inversions. Clint Brooks, who believed that paradox is, I quote, is the language appropriate and inevitable to poetry, language appropriate and inevitable to poetry, unquote, regarded it, along with irony, to be instrumental in what he called meaning construction. Right? So if we just dwell on what Brooks believed, that it is paradox is integral and intrinsic to the language of poetry. And he uses the word inevitable, that you cannot really go anywhere without taking recourse to paradox when you are writing poetry, and the fact that it is essential to what he calls meaning construction. Right. If the poet is concerned with fashioning some kind of meaning in his poem or in her poem, then she has to resort to paradox, because ultimately the poet is trying to say something, and this communication hinges on her ability to construct meaning. So, understood this way, paradox becomes a building block in the synthesis of sense that a poem essentially strives to achieve, or should we say a link in the chain of argument so cleverly strung together by her. So, it is a building block or a chain in a larger uh, chain, you know, which will together put forth the meaning. Now, if we look at the, no, I don't have a slide on this. In the poem, Truth is as old as God. She has a poem. She wrote very brief poems, short ones, very pithy, extremely condensed, extremely cryptic poems, and where it's difficult, for the reader to come to terms with the meaning very easily, because the poems don't yield their meanings that easily. In the poem, Truth is as old as God, Dickinson opines that while God has disappeared, he is still there somewhere, not immediately discernible perhaps, but is a potential presence. And then she follows this up, this line of thought or reasoning, in certain other poems as well, reinforcing this argument that yes, God is there somewhere, but he is not visible and not perceptible, but he may be felt as a potential presence. However, in poet number 373, this world is not conclusion. I have a slide on this, and it can be shown. This world is not conclusion. In this poem, while she is on that same subject about the presence or absence of God, she is full of doubts, and she observes in the last two lines of the poem, narcotics cannot still the truth that nibbles at the soul. This is the first slide, and the poem ends on this note: narcotics cannot still the truth that nibbles at the soul, referring to the spiritual agony that attends the awareness of divine absence despite the use of opiates. And she goes on to talk about, take into account various issues. For example, she says that she talks about, just a minute. Yeah, she talks about, she uses certain words and expressions such as baffles, don't know, riddle, and so on. So this is the terminology of inscrutability which she employs in the poem. So basically, she's trying to say that no one really knows about the existence or identity of God. We can at best approach him or her, you know, through a cryptic veil, right? And it has always puzzled scholars, she goes on to mention later. And she talks about the pulpit and the sermons which have been delivered from the pulpits and so on, and the hallelujahs rolling from the church services. But the fact remains that that doesn't really take us any closer to God. So the metaphysical doubt experienced by the speaker in this poem is expressed through, as I said, a terminology of inscrutability. As for example, she uses words and expressions such as riddles, baffles, puzzles, don't know, and sagacity must go through a riddle, and so on. So there is something beyond this known world which defies human understanding, and which it is not possible to approximate through organized structures such as sermons and other philosophical discourses, which are woefully inadequate, in making any meaning, in helping us to make any meaning of this transcendent reality represented by God. In poem 800, She develops these earlier speculations to maintain that God's disappearance is followed by the entry of death. And in a very macabre way, she uses the word jest. She says, God and death intriguingly and bizarrely become rivals, each vying for the soul of man. Right? So, what is she saying in this poem, poem number 800? She is saying that if God disappears from our life, there would be a void or an emptiness or an absence. And that absence paradoxically becomes synonymous with death. So the absence of God becomes death, right? And again, paradoxically, God and death become contenders for the soul of man. Thus, if we look at the poems that we had just referred to a little while ago, and the one which I am discussing now, we shall realize that the poem makes a movement. She moves from a primary paradox, positing God's simultaneous presence and absence in an earlier poem, to an altogether more complicated scenario, where God's absence, which is death, in a way becomes his de facto competitor. You know, so it is this ingenious way in which she develops a line of thought or a particular phase of the argument, and complicates it with paradoxical uh, uh, stances. Now, it was Dickinson's uncompromising intellectual honesty which prevented her from glossing magisterially over eternal questions such as those pertaining to God, life, death, and the afterlife, you know, to many of which human beings have no answers. So instead of assuming an easy oracular stance, the poet explored typically a plethora of perspectives which tempt one to make a choice, but she rarely did make that choice, and she allowed the competing positions to develop into paradoxes. In other words, the meaning remained suspended between the polarities of the paradoxes. The poet's use of paradox leads one to believe that there is not one truth, but several truths, which imbue her poetry with an inherent ambiguity, leading to the possibility of simultaneous readings, each as viable as the other. Truth, for Dickinson, we realize, was thus not a destination but a journey, not a dot of certainty on the plotted graph of intellectual speculation, but the distance between hypotheses to be negotiated. And it certainly was not just the pursuit of an idea, but an epistemological epiphany achieved through as much her methods as her metaphysics. So this is what I, uh, uh, gather about what she probably thought about truth. Of course, we can only guess, make intelligent guesses at what she probably had in mind. And this is where I have already referred to ambiguity. This is where her modernity lies. She was a 20th century poet. She was a reclusive poet, who remained largely within the domestic environs. And yet, if you look at the elements that she uses in her poetry, ellipsis, ambiguity, paradox, you know, uh, these are the these are typically modernist elements, which she harnesses. That shows us and that tells us that she was so far ahead, for her times. The mentioned ambiguity often invests Dickinson's poems with the appearance of riddles. And in fact, he had a number of poems which have been designated riddle poems. Now, let us take the poem I Cannot Live With You as an illustration of this viewpoint. Slide number 5, I think, slide 5. You can have the text before you. Now, regarded as one of the greatest love poems written by Dickinson, this poem intriguingly has the appearance of an anti love poem, because right from the opening, the very first line, Dickinson keeps inverting or subverting the positions which she is adopting. From the very start, the poet overturns expectations, working her way through a series of inversions which are both thematic and structural. There are five movements or phases as we find in the poem. Five phases of argument which put forth why the speaker cannot live with her beloved, why she cannot die with him, why she cannot fall with him, fall in the Christian sense of, uh, you know, incurring damnation, why she cannot rise with him, again, in the specifically Christian theological sense of attaining salvation, and finally, when they meet, why they have to, I quote, meet apart. So these are the five distinct phases of the argument, and so wittily, so ingeniously, she provides, her arguments for why she cannot do these things as she has uh, listed them in the poem. When she follows her opening declaration, I cannot live with you, with the line, it would be life. She deflates, in a deadpan manner, the traditional rationale of the beginning of a love poem, which would commonly have said, I cannot live without you, it would be death. That is what we are accustomed to hearing. I cannot live without you, it would be death. But Dickinson, in her trademark manner, overturns this and she says, I cannot live with you, it would be life. So this is the kind of paradoxical uh, technique which she typically uses in her poetry. Her next statement, life is over there, behind the shelf, at once profound and pedestrian, captures the inconsistencies in the notion of an all-encompassing abstraction like life being relegated to a shelf. Life is all around us, it surrounds us. How can we put it on a shelf? How can it lie on the shelf stagnating? But then we realize life probably is stagnant precisely because it has death in it. When in the next two stanzas, this life is compared to, I quote, his porcelain like a cup discarded of the housewife, unquote. The grey image of holy Christendom is conflated with the domestic china of the housewife. Man, cast in God's image, is fragile like porcelain and is liable to crack. The sexton's porcelain could well be the human clay fashioned by God, the master craftsman. So she's able to capture so many contrary things at once, through these opening stanzas. The answer to why the speaker could not die with her beloved. We have already heard why she cannot live with her beloved. Now we move on to why she cannot die with her beloved. This is again couched in contradictions. She says, quote, and I, could I stand by and see you freeze without my right of frost, death's privilege, unquote. So this is the question that she asked, that if he dies, I should also claim that privilege of death, right? But she gives an answer. She says that somebody is required to be there to remain alive in order to close the eyelids of the dead lover. So that is the responsibility which devolves upon her. So this is the reason why she cannot die with her lover but has to remain alive. So the expected sorrow of a grieving lover is countermanded through a legal vocabulary of entitlement, evident in the words right and privilege. She would be required, as we said, to shut the eyelids of her dead beloved, and so she could not die with him. And another reason which she advances in this segment of the poem as to why she couldn't die with her lover is that since death is decided on by destiny, or should we say God, its hour in human lives may not be calculated according to mortal convenience, but requires surrender to the different timings of death. We have to submit to the appointed hour as divined by fate, as determined by our Creator. So that is the second reason as to why she cannot die with her uh, lover. And something to that effect is used in the poem, My Life Had Stood a Loaded Gun, a very famous poem by Dickinson, in which he says, I quote, for I have but the power to kill without the power to die. So she says, since I have a weapon in my hands, I can kill someone else, but I cannot take my own life. So, in other words, she says that she is, in a sense, powerless. So, she gets into the discourse of or the dichotomy of power and powerlessness in this poem. And then if we return to why, return to the poem, uh, I cannot live with you, we see that she would not be able to rise, quote unquote, rise with her beloved, as the latter's face would outshine that of Jesus, thus depriving her of salvation. And if you just look at the poem displayed before you, you will get an idea of this. That where she says that she would not be able to rise, because rise in the sense of attaining salvation or getting a glimpse of heaven or being accepted in heaven, because her lover's face would intervene between her and the beatific vision of heaven, and her lover's face would eclipse that of Jesus, and the beloved's face would so saturate her sight that she would have, quote, no more eyes for sordid excellence as paradise, unquote. An attitude and action at once boldly blasphemous for its time and audaciously adulatory in romantic adoration. And the use of the term the sordid excellence of paradise is again oxymoronic, you know, because it yokes together opposite ideas and reinforces the paradoxical imagination of Dickinson seen to be at work here. We move on to the next phase of the argument. Why the speaker could not fall with her beloved. That is why she could not be consigned to hell or be damned. Why they couldn't do it together is because she says that if the beloved were lost, that is damned, and she were to be saved, you know, she would still be in a reversal of expectation, as lost as he, because heaven would be hell without him. So even if she were to be taken up to heaven, that heaven would become hell for her because the beloved would not be with her. And were you lost, I would be, though my name ran loudest on the heavenly fame. Unquote. That if he was lost, so would she be lost, notwithstanding the fact she had been accepted in heaven. On the other hand, were he saved and she could not be with him, for whatever reason, if the opposite were to be true, it would still be hell for her. Because wherever, he was not present and she was, it would mean a kind of hell for her. So the clever interchange between the states of heaven and hell and the conditions of being saved or lost, with their usual associations inverted according to the logic of the present argument, bespeaks a brilliant manipulation of perspectives that was at the core of Dickinson's poetic technique. If the speaker in the poem cannot live, die, rise, or fall with the beloved, the only option left for them perhaps is to, as she says, meet apart, within quotes, meet apart. As she says in the final stanza, quote, so we must meet apart, you there, I here, unquote, with the door between them ajar. And so through these lines, he conjures up quite a felicitous image of cozy domesticity, with the lovers being in adjoining rooms and there being just a door ajar, and yes, a door ajar between them. You know, while this might seem like a conclusion, it actually spawns more confusion than it clears. And at this point, when one can safely assume the lovers' proximity, with them being in adjacent rooms, you know, suddenly this enclosed domestic setting is unexpectedly overruled by a rather ominous reference to oceans, and the image of the ocean inundating the enclosed context, it immediately, this image inundates the enclosed context with its elemental vigor and vastness, evoking the separation that continues to haunt the speaker and her beloved. So in the space of exactly 8 simple words, the poet introduces two worlds which are poles apart in their geographical and emotional orientation, taking the reader from the proposition of a sort of tentative, proximity between the two, or something which could have been, could have tempted us to assume that she is offering us a hint of a resolution. So we cannot get that consolation of a possible resolution, but instead we are exposed to a devastating dissolution. Sorry, we are exposed to a devastating desolation which is induced by the image of the separating sea. So the door ajar suddenly and unexpectedly transforms into the image of the separating sea, wildly thrashing a cosmic image which serves to keep the lovers apart. So she was capable of springing these surprises, these sudden turns of phrases and thought and imagery, which invested her poems, with this capacity to forever amaze and astonish the reader. Thus, the term "meet apart", essentially oxymoronic, does not resolve the contentions explored earlier so much as complicate them further. The rhymes, if you notice the use of the half rhymes, prayer and despair, at the end of the poem, through their opposing associations, further point to the impossibility of achieving a solution to the conundrums of a common or mutual existence for the lover. Basically, she wants that the lovers should be together in whichever dimension, in life or death, or salvation, damnation, but this is not something that she is hopeful of achieving. So finally, she settles for the fifth and last phase of the argument, which is a shared separation, and that is how the poem ends, right? And she makes it clear in the last stanza that it is not hope that will help the lovers connect, but its opposite, despair. And this is where the play of paradox comes in very powerfully. We readers are used to expecting, uh, the beneficial agency of hope. Hope is seen to be a kind of a solution to many problems. But paradoxically, Dickinson maintains that it is not hope, but its opposite, despair, that will sustain them, even as prayer is looked upon as an alternative. So, as long as they're in the throes of desolation and despair, at least their relationship will be there, will be highlighted. As a final twist in the narrative of impossibility, the poet attributes whiteness to despair. Not only does she posit despair as an alternative to hope, but she further complicates this abstraction by describing it as white. Generally, we tend to think in terms of black despair, but interestingly, Dickinson says that it is white in color, thereby subverting its traditional black associations. Not only is despair traditionally understood as hopeless, but in the syllogistic scheme of the poem, it appears as a source of sustenance. Ironically validating the existence and continuity of the two protagonists, and their search for a mutually inclusive status that animates the poem. So, hopeless as it is, despair is yet harnessed in a positive sense by Dickinson. And possibly for that reason, it is called white in the paradoxical context of the poem. Now, here I would like to share a comment made by Harold Bloom regarding Dickinson's poetics. And Bloom has said, I quote, "Of all poets writing in English in the 19th and 20th centuries, I judge Emily Dickinson to present us with the most authentic cognitive difficulties. The most authentic cognitive difficulties," unquote. So basically, cognitive would mean the reader's attempt to mental efforts of knowing or understanding what the poem is talking about. So what made Dickinson, uh, Dickinson's poetry posed such a challenge to the cognitive capacities of the reader. I would say that the poet's personal uncertainties regarding the nature and apprehension of truth, her quiet rebellion against dogma, and her self reflexive criticisms led to the fine existential ironies that characterize her best work and which challenge the reader's mental efforts of knowing, reasoning, or understanding the same. I'm trying to provide some kind of a rationale as to what made Dickinson such an important poet, such a important poet, as also a poet who was very difficult to understand. By constantly redistributing the focus and shifting the balance of meaning in her poems, Dickinson is seen to negotiate a tightrope between different hypotheses, swinging from one end to the other, thus keeping the intellectual impetus forever in motion. Now, if you look at the poem, much madness is the divinest sense. I'm sorry, I don't think I have a slide on this. Dickinson holds the view that what appears as madness is often not only perfectly sane, but is ultimate wisdom, just as rationality, the normative measure of sanity, may be utterly crazy, thereby overturning standard perceptions of states of mental being. So, in this poem, much madness is the divinest sense. She once again employs paradox, saying that a person conventionally regarded as mad may be extremely wise, and vice versa. Similarly, in the poem, the poet's light but lamps themselves go out. She dwells on another paradox, and that is the insignificance of poets beside their poetic creation. She says that the poets are the agents who light the lamps, that is, who bring the poem into being, into existence. So the poet, in his capacity as the creator, is the primary source, and the poem is the secondary. The poem or the creation is the secondary, uh, you know, factor here. But he says that the poet is eclipsed by the poem. So basically, he's trying to say that being the source of light or enlightenment, the poet is yet extinguished by the very flames that she ignites, right? And poem 569, titled I Reckon When I Count It All, similarly derives its meaning from a clever slate of thought, where she holds that while the poet writes poetry to banish loneliness, strangely for her, and for many other poets perhaps, loneliness is a prerequisite for writing poetry. You know. So, this is the thesis that she advances here. So, how does one reconcile these opposites? Does a poet write poetry to banish loneliness, or is loneliness required to be there from the start for her to be able to write poetry? So, the motive and the cause become one and the same thing in the paradoxical imagination of Dickinson, who seeks to locate the truth between polarities. The motive and the cause, in this case, becoming the same. Now, Clint Brooks argues that a critic should concern himself with, I quote, the paradoxes that spring from the very nature of the poet's language, unquote. A stand which Letitia too supports when he says, quote, irony, wit, and paradox are inherent qualities of poetry, unquote. Why I refer to these comments made by Brooks and Letitia is to uh, reinforce the second part of my titular proposition. If you look at the title, the second part of the title, the question as to whether poetry as a discipline is paradoxical in nature, the poetry of paradox or the paradox of poetry. So, the very language of poetry is looked upon by seminal modern critics to be paradoxical in nature. See, a poet may have been inspired in a certain way, but his poem very often turns out to be quite different from what he had originally envisaged. Now, even if that were not to be the case, critics arrive at very different conclusions, complicating the reception of the work. The meaning of a particular poem changes from age to age, you know. So there is no stable meaning to be located in a work of art or in a poem. And it lends itself to multiple interpretations, according to the age, according to uh, the country where it is being discussed, and by the orientation of the reader. So, in that sense, I connect with the latter part of my titular proposition, that is poetry intrinsically by nature paradoxical? Now, in Dickinson's poetry, to come back to the first part, my primary contention, the poetry of paradox, in Dickinson's poetry, paradox, which is itself dependent on a duality, or should we say a polarity for its effect, is frequently accompanied by a doubleness of vision. Paradox itself, a kind of a dual mode of perception, is wedded to another doubleness of vision, which more often than not is, makes it even more complicated. Now, I had referred to the poem, My Life Had Stood a Loaded Gun. And in this poem, the poet observes that the owner took away the gun. The owner took away the gun. Now, it's a very cryptic poem. It does not yield its meaning easily, and we have to, examine it for different meanings. Now, well, if her life is the loaded gun, it stands to reason that she is its owner. This is one way of looking at it. Alternatively, as always in the case of Dickinson, the so-called owner could also mean God, who owns all creatures. So, if we go along with the first proposition that the speaker is the owner of the weapon of her life, she is ironically not in control of things, for she cannot determine the hour of her own death, thereby diluting the very meaning of ownership with its sense of possession and entitlement. Now, if we believe the second suggestion that God is the owner, then she would still be powerless to do anything, to take her life, to turn the gun against herself, because, as she says, she has the power to kill without the power to die. And so, Dickinson puts up a very clever contrast, between kill and die. She works clever, ingenious contrast between these two words and two concepts, kill and die. Here, the words kill and die, I feel, have been used in their opposing senses. The former having to do with the subjective, the former having to do with the objective perpetration of death, and the latter with the subjective surrender to a process of extinction. This famous poem derives its effect from the paradox at its center, namely that the speaker is impotent for all her recourse to arms, for all her access to a weapon, fully loaded gun. You know, she cannot fire at will. What's the point in her possessing this weapon if she cannot fire it at will or use it to influence her life in any way? So this is the question that Dickinson posits. She's always teasing the reader, to explore the unexplored pathways in her poetry. In her celebrated poem, Because I Could Not Stop for Death, I'm sure most of you are aware of this poem, having read it at some point or the other. She describes a carriage ride which the speaker takes, and she says, Because I could not stop for death, he very kindly stopped for me. And death is shown as a very courteous gentleman, and she enters the carriage to find immortality sitting in the carriage, and together they undertake a journey, and they pass the school, a school where the children are seen to be playing during recess, and the fields of grain, and so on. And then she comes to a house which looks like a grave, and finally the poem ends with the synecdoche, horses' heads which were turned towards eternity. So, in a gist, I have tried to share the main points of this poem, Because I Could Not Stop for Death, with you. You know, but point is that she explores profound issues in this poem in a very matter-of-fact language, and she invokes alternative perspectives on practically every point that she makes in the poem. Just as in the poem which I discussed at length, I Cannot Live With You, she makes the proposition only to subvert it. Similarly, here, she said, it is not clear whether the speaker is already dead or is traveling towards death. Again, a very famous poem by her, I Heard a Fly Buzz, explores a similar situation where she's writing The speaker is composing the poem after her death. So here it is not clear whether the speaker is already dead or is traveling towards death. Seated inside the carriage is immortality, who may be the comforting symbol of the Christian afterlife, or alternatively be, she might represent the permanent nothingness that awaits us in death. While the speaker mentions that the carriage passed the sites centuries ago, she also mentions that the entire time referred to feels, I quote, shorter than a day. So centuries and shorter than a day, contradict each other, intercutting two opposing time schemes and furthering the general perception of inconclusiveness generated by the poem. In Because She Could Not Stop for Death, Paradox informs the imagery too, intensifying the mystifying effects that the poem achieves. The carriage, innocuous in its original associations as a horse drawn vehicle, ironically doubles up as a hearse, while the gossamer gown and the tulle tippet suggest bridal attire, and it is starkly inappropriate for here in the funereal context. Such an ironical transposition is seen in the grave image later in the poem as well, because it has been introduced as a house. And house, as you all know, is traditionally associated with security, comfort, you know, but it has been conflated with the grave image. The horse's heads being a synecdoche at the end of the poem not only represents the whole, but potentially subsumes the whole in its alteration and redefinition of scope and vision. So, here, as elsewhere in Dickinson's canon, paradox distills poetic vision in the crucible of wit so that we are finally left with thought that is irreducibly compact and extraordinarily complex. The poet herself is best equipped to speak on her cryptic and mystifying use of paradox in her poetry. She expresses this trait beautifully in poem number 1263, the poem called To Tell All the Truth But Tell It Slant, where she argues that truth should be allowed to, I use her language, dazzle gradually with, within quotes, explanation kind, which would otherwise strike like lightning with superb surprise and make their victims blind. So Dickinson thus dazzles her readers gradually into understanding of truth, exploring the latter in an oblique or slant fashion through her consummate use of paradox. So I end with this poem, which is the last slide in my presentation by Dickinson, which, which enlightens us about her aesthetic practice with particular reference to her graded revelation of the truth. She says she doesn't want to reveal the entire truth at one go because it would make the reader blind with the superb surprise that she carried, that it will visit upon the reader. It will strike the reader like a flash of lightning and make the reader blind. So her intention is to dazzle gradually with explanation kind. And here she employs paradox, most famously to gradually reveal what she has in mind. So I'll just read out this very brief and delightfully cryptic poem. Tell all the tell all the truth, but tell it slant. Success in circuit lies too bright for our infirm delight. The truth's superb surprise, as lightning to the children, eased with explanation kind. The truth must dazzle gradually, or every man be blind. And with that, I come, with the words of the poet herself, explicating her use of paradox, I come to the end of my talk, hoping the latter has stimulated you to ask at least a few questions. Thank you very much.
I guess then we have to thank on behalf of the Prophet and all the viewers who have experienced this very insightful lecture from our honorable Palestinians. Um, uh,
thank. This is very significant word to express our uh, feeling for you. Okay, we have one question, and this question also from one of my former teachers. So I'm taking this question uh, on the screen. I'm reading it out for you too. This is from Anushua Ward from our respectable, respected Anushua ma'am. I hope you can find it on the screen. Still, I'm reading it out for you.
Hmm.
A sublime lecture, Ajanta Di, while you profound on the nuances of Dickinson's rhetoric, could you please say if her own reclusive life, her sunning of publicity, and her reconciliation with her own passions gave rise to such rhetoric? Was there an irony pointed towards society itself? Please offer your comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Anushwa. Uh, uh, yes, you have tried to draw a parallel between her reclusive life and her uh, uh, minimal use of words in her poetry. You know, as I have mentioned, she shunned the public discourse. You know, 19th century America, a nation in the making, the institutions of the nation were being established at that time. And we remember Dickinson's contemporary, Walt Whitman. Walt Whitman, with his, bardic voice, being the bard of America and participating in a major way in the larger discourses of national life, he was always in the spotlight. And on the other hand, we have his reclusive contemporary, Emily Dickinson. You know. Her reclusiveness stemmed from her desire for isolation, for her, you know, for her Pasha for being by herself. She was completely at ease, being by herself. And she never felt that it was anything abnormal, though people tended to look upon her as an eccentric. And the local people would call her the myth. They had given her the name myth. And as she grew older, this so-called eccentricity developed more and more, so that she would not come out of her room at all. you know but I think that her uh, you use the word rhetoric, but I think that rhetoric was something that she really shunned, because she believed that language at the end of the day doesn't have the power to communicate the vision of the poet. The poet might strive to get across this vision, but eventually, how successful is she? And this is a feeling which was shared by the later writers, the 20th century writers such as Hemingway and Faulkner as well. They were dead against any use of rhetoric. You know, so they tried to keep it minimal. So that the authenticity could be preserved. Right. And yes, you mentioned something about society. Absolutely. She was a great critic of society. And most of her poems, as we see, are quite hard hitting, because she is not content to, go along with very easy solutions. You know. So that is the whole point of her poetry, that she's forever probing deeper and deeper and trying to divine the depths of truth, so that it's not something easy negotiating uh, the truth. So you have brought in various strands, her uh, uh, response to society. Yes, she was deeply critical of contemporary society. Probably as a result of that, maybe she drew further and further into her own shell. That could be a reason, yes. And most of her poems, as I said, critique society. You know, and some also say, ask what about her notions on religion. You know, she was a very spiritual person. Initially, she was a believer in Christianity. Her family members were. She was of Puritan stock, but she was never a part of the religious revival of the age. You know, and she was too individualistic, too original a thinker, too skeptical uh, mindset, not for it not to be able to influence her worldview. I hope I've been able to answer the question, Anushwa.
So, ma'am, I hope that Anuswa will also leave her comment that she has got her answer. So, ma'am, we have a few more questions left. So, I'm taking the question on the screen. I hope that this question. Okay. I'm reading it out for you, ma'am.
Yes, yes.
Ma'am, the poetry of Emily Dickinson sometimes challenges the societal norms. And in the time when she was writing, perhaps see that a type of mistake is there. She was writing, what are the views regarding her poetry from the male poets of her time? Like, is there any kind of gender tension brewing with her poetry at that time?
Yes, certainly, because what accounts for the paucity of publication during her lifetime? Why did she publish only just a few poems during her lifetime? In her family, her father was dead against women writing poetry or women publishing poetry. So there was this frustration within her, that why should she not be able to voice her feelings and thoughts and visions in a larger sense, in a larger way. you know. And Bradstreet in the 17th century, in 17th century America, pioneering woman poet, you know, had faced the same problem. In the next century, 18th century, Phyllis Wheatley, the African American woman poet, had faced the same problem. And during Dickinson's time in the 19th century too, male poets were not too kindly disposed towards women. That is why in the course of my talk I did mention that, initially, the very opening, that though she was appeared to be content within her domestic domain, she yet was able to transcend the same so effortlessly, you know. And there was people were not so willing to accept it, you know, given the times. And that too, she takes up such boldly audacious, perspectives regarding love and other uh, issues, right? And at the same time, having said that, I must mention that, well, Dickinson did have many mentors in her life as well, and these mentors were male. Some of them were male. She enjoyed a very enriching relationship with her sister-in-law Susan, the wife of her brother Austin. She was very close to her brother Austin, and Sue was also her editorial, sounding board. So they had a kind of intellectual, enjoyed an intellectual rapport. And but there were men also, notably, Thomas Wentworth Higginson, you know who was a big mentor figure in her poetry. And she has a clutch of poems, a group of poems called the Master Poems, right? And to date, till date, people have not been able to decipher who exactly this master is. You know, so this master, as described by her, is the epitome of perfection. Somebody who has godly attributes and brings out the best in her. So there are two sides to this. There were men in her life who were appreciative, who helped her develop, her poetic talent. But there were others also who proved to be, inhibitory with regard to her self-expression. Yes. Next
Thank you, ma'am.
question, please.
Yes, ma'am. Taking the question on the screen. You can edit out. It's a small one. Ajuntadi, this is from Molini Mukherjee. Ajuntadi,
Okay.
is there a certain similarity in the thought process of Emily Dickinson and Emily Bronte?
Well, both were very stylistically original, I would say. They were rebels in their own way, right? And they used language very innovatively. And when your question is on thought process, so yes, they were trying to transcend the limitations imposed on them by society, you know. So there is, in Emily Bronte, there was more of passion, which I we don't get to see in that measure or to that extent in Dickinson's poetry. But with regard to their attitude to society, we might conclude that yes, they were both trying to subvert stereotypes, challenge assumptions, you know, go beyond the conventional mindset, right? So that is there. very much so. And both consequently used and employed and exploited language in very innovative ways to get across their respective visions. Yes,
I'm taking next one, but I don't find any question in this text. Perhaps he wants to get cleared about this thing. From the Pounded Roy, from the emphasis on the phrase, the truth must dazzle. I think she
yes,
had a strong and deep experience with spirituality. Maybe in a way, she was being hopeful for the entire humankind.
yes. So I actually ended the talk with a reference to this poem where she says, "The truth must dazzle." I think this is an amazing expression, you know. And she says that if it visits us at one go, it will be like the strike of a lightning. So, as you say, that well, it is something that comes from above, high voltage apprehension of truth which strikes us. So this is like maybe in the nature of an epiphany, a sudden flash of spiritual illumination which the reader experiences. So it happens, it can happen like that. And uh, she wants to kind of buffer the reader, so to speak, from this kind of a visitation because it may become too much for the poet. You're quite right that it is not all negative, that she herself had an inner spiritual life, which was probably, sometimes at least, if not always, it must have been very rewarding. And she gained her, her sustenance, her inspiration from this core deep down in her heart. And that is why she says, that this truth, which is very often a divine revelation or a revelation of the divine, you know, it dazzles, right? And it may prove too right for us. And so she tempers it with explanation kind so that, you know, it, uh, it is more, uh, yes, so that so that the superb surprise which it affords will be eased, right? Or one will be blind. I think Dipandev, you are quite right. I go along with your understanding of what probably Dickinson meant by this, you know, by this poem. She kind of gives us uh, a glimpse into her heart, what motivates her vision and her aesthetics, and how she must reveal the truth gradually to her readers in her poetry through her paradox, and how she uses paradox to reveal this truth gradually.
Thank you. There is another question. The question is on your screen. This is from
Yes.
Sanjay Soren. Ma'am, it is very illuminating lecture. What is Emily Dickinson's view, perhaps, her view about death? Please, ma'am. Thank you.
Yes, Dickinson has spoken at length about death. So many of her poems are about death. Because I could not stop for death is a case in point. I heard a fly buzz and innumerable poems, out of a total corpus of 1800 poems. And so she was inordinately taken up with this notion of death. And, just as in Rabindranath's life there had been a Mrityur Michil, so also in her life, right, from since her childhood she had come across many deaths. In fact, she lost one of her cousins when she was just 14, and she almost underwent a nervous breakdown, and she had to be sent to Boston and, rehabilitated and so on. So death worked very powerfully. The incidence of physical death, as it happened with her friends and relatives. And then she has another poem, which where she says, just a second. Yes, I'll read out this poem, poem 49, where she says, "I never lost as much but twice, and that was in the sword. And she says that I have stood a beggar before the door of God when I lost two close people in succession. And the angels came down and reimbursed my store. But She says, burglar, banker, father, I'm poor once more. So look at the way she addresses God here. She says, God is a banker, a rich repository of life, but God is a burglar. God gives and takes away as well. You know, so she was personally haunted by the specter of death, in her life, as it were, and she writes compulsively about death in her poetry. And she is very frank, as I have told you, that she doesn't profess to know, as in none of us can, as to what death is all about. So often she writes poems from the perspective of a dead person, as for example, because I could not stop for death, or I heard a fly buzz, right, where the person is already dead and looking back at the situation. you know so she does complicate this whole notion. She's very frank about the human inability to understand what death is all about, and yet she does not give up trying to explore this ultimate abstraction. Yes, Gautam.
Okay, ma'am. This is from ma'am. Thank you so much for clarifying my ideas. Thank you for enumerating so nicely. And this is
Thank
from
you, all of you, for asking these questions.
okay. This is from Disha. Disha for Disha got answer, and there's several lots of thanks we have got. This is from Molini Mukherjee. Thank you so much, Didi. So several messages have already come who have conveyed their wishes to you. So thank you very much, ma'am,
I
and
reciprocate their wishes warmly. Thank you, all of you.
thank you very much.
Thank you for bearing with me. Yes, yes,
No,
Gautam.
it is very illuminating session to all of us. It's very intriguing session, and I do hope that next time, whenever we will approach you, we will get your positive
Of
note
course,
for our next
you're
venture
most
also.
welcome.
Okay. So on this note, I'm taking you, ma'am,
Thank you.
off the screen, and please be there. I have a few words with you, then I will leave you. So thank you very much for watching this session, and very soon, who have registered for this session, you will get one feedback link in your email account, and you can just register your feedback to get e-certificate. So thank you very much for this entire session, and our next session coming soon. Till then, tada, bye bye, stay safe, stay protected. Good night.